affiliated with the military, but contracted through the military at Abu Ghraib prisons outside of Baghdad, as well as allegations of torture of other Iraqis by British soldiers, are headline news. The shocking revelation and photographs provided stark proof that torture is not a relic of our past, right? So that's a direct quote. So what we saw in the exposure of the interrogation tactics by U.S. military servicemen and contractors, argues the author, are the following. It was a public exposure of torture by the U.S. government, and it served as proof that this was happening. Now, remember, in order for us conceptually to define this as torture, we have to make sure that, though the author doesn't bring this up in the text at this point, that the condition of custody is satisfied, which obviously it was. Right? The condition of custody has to be satisfied. Right? So attempting to make sense of the level, really, the horrific level of violence that occurred, and the ongoing generational repercussions that it's going to have, because it's not like that will ever pass. It will forever have repercussions generationally, the images. For the author, there's a sense in which this is proof, it's evidence that torture is still a problem. It is no longer what she says is, quote-unquote, a relic of the past. Okay, now, insofar as we talk about torture, you have to recognize that there's going to be an intent, if you will, to deny the occurrence of torture. On a side note, I'm currently publishing a book on genocidal intentionality, and one of the aspects that I had to incorporate in the book was a recognition that prior to the orchestration and the operationalization of a systematized process of extermination, genocide, when you're in the planning phase, you have to plan your alibi. You have to deny your participation in genocide. And I did exactly the same thing that the author did. I used different tools of assessment and I came to different conclusions. But the idea is, if we are going to torture this individual or these individuals, we recognize that we could potentially be challenged for having tortured this individual. And obviously we know that torture is internationally criminalized. Thus, we had better make sure that we can deny the fact that the event was torture, or what participated was torture, or how you interpret it was torture. So there are 3 methods of denying torture, and I'm going to go through conceptually each of these 3 methods. So these are 3 methods for denying torture. The first method, well, first before I get into the states, the different methods of denying torture, let me read this quote. Quote, "No torturing regime defends or even acknowledges its own torture as torture." Very powerful line. Let me read that again. Quote, "No torturing regime defends," yeah, we defend that we tortured, right? "No torturing regime defends or even acknowledges its own torture as torture." And how do they go about denying it? Well, by implementing any of the following 3 modes of denial. The first is literal denial. Literal denial. What is literal denial? The state denies that torture took place, right? The state or the contracting agency or whoever's in custody or military, paramilitary, police unit, what have you, denies that torture took place. So A, denies first thing to do is to deny that torture took place. This is literal denial. I literally am denying, no, that didn't happen. Okay. B, state accuses those claiming torture to be enemies of the state. as an aspect of literal denial, if you're going to charge me, the state, the political establishment, or just the establishment, of torturing individuals, then you are, in your accusation, an enemy of the state. Right? So the mere accusation that the state participated in an act of torture, in terms of literal denial, makes the party evoking such an allegation an immediate enemy of the state. Enemy of the state for having alleged acts of, right? You're an enemy of the state for even having alleged an act of torture, right? So, literal denial, rather obvious. Number two is what's known as an interpretive denial. This one's a little bit more complicated, really not too difficult to understand, but I'm not just literally denying that the act happened. A different version is an interpretive denial. Interpretive denial. I'll read the quote. Quote, a state refutes allegations by saying that what happened is not torture, but something else. For example, enhanced interrogation, right? So, as is the case that unfolded, right? The author is saying the state has been charged with acts of torture. And in order to deny that the acts were in fact acts of torture, the state reinterprets the acts not as torture but as enhanced interrogation or forceful coercion or what have you, right? Some jargon that you put together to say that it wasn't what it was, and what it was an act of torture. But I can't say that it's an act of torture because there are international legal implications and moral and socio-cultural implications for me admitting willfully that I am a torturer. I can't do that. I can do that in the privacy of some secluded area for those who will allow me to do that. But when I come publicly, I can't do that. I can't say that. You can't even contemplate saying something like that. It's the most vile person in the world. So what ends up happening? The state reinterprets it. No, it wasn't an act of torture. It was an act of enhanced interrogation. Yes, we did it. It's not a denial of the act now, right? It's not a literal denial of the act. Yes, what we did was X. But what you have to recognize is that that's not torture. This is, and that's not this, right? That's the sort of, that's the mode, right? So, a state refutes allegations by saying that what happened is not torture but something else, right? We call it reframing. So I'll just put reframe. Right? The idea that torture, it was an act of torture, is reframed into something else. Right? It wasn't torture, it was enhanced interrogation, or it was forceful coercion, or it was what have you. Okay. B. State accuses those claiming torture of failing to understand the distinction. So rather than being as forceful of saying that those who present allegations of torture are enemies of the state, what the state says, it's not going to say that, hey, since you presented an allegation that we were torturing, we're not going to claim you an enemy of the state. That's a bit extreme. What we're going to do is you fail to understand the interpretive distinction between what torture is and why this act is not an act of torture, right? So what the state says is that there's a failure. Whoever alleges the act of torture fails to recognize the interpretive distinction. Right? So whoever is waging these allegations, arguably, in an attempt to deny the act of torture as an act of torture, says, well, you know, whoever you are, you just don't understand. You just don't understand. It's not an act of torture. It's an interrogation tactic, and it's an enhanced interrogation tactic. But you know, you have regular sort of pedestrian interrogation tactics, you have more enhanced interrogation tactics, and then you have